Open my lips that I may proclaim your praise. Open all of our ears and hearts that we may receive your word, that it may take root and grow and produce abundantly. For the glory of Jesus we ask. Amen. As we've been moving through the Gospel of Luke, we're coming to the whole book is great, but this is a really wonderful section of Luke where there's lots of action and there are these incredible miracles. And our story for this week is a short story, just a few verses, but so poignant and sweet and powerful. It's the story of Jesus raising a dead man to life, the only son of his mother, a widow in the town of Nain. At the outset, I want to talk about our expectations when it comes to resurrection and resurrection stories. If you've lived more than a few years on this earth, you have been touched in some way by death. You've lost friends, family. And it cuts us, does it not? It hurts us. We grieve over those we lose. Death is the enemy. And death hangs over each one of us, whether we are aware of it or not. We spend a good bit of our lives trying to ignore the fact that death comes for all. When you're young, it's easy to ignore that. As you get older, you begin to realize, a few more years on this earth, and that's all I've got. This enemy, death, stalks us. And we go to great lengths to ignore the reality of death or to try to cheat death. I myself have grappled, as I'm sure some of you have, with the question, since God has the power to raise the dead, why don't we see it happen more often? Especially when death strikes close to home for us. We read these stories in the Bible of these incredible resurrections, and we ask, often in our hearts, as we grieve and mourn and bargain with God, just do a resurrection for me. But to put this in perspective, as I prepared the message this week, I counted up the resurrections that are found in the Bible. There are 11. 11 instances of resurrection. In each one of those cases, one person was raised, except there's this one strange story in the Gospel of Matthew where a whole bunch of people got raised when Jesus was raised. But just 11. 11 resurrection stories. Only 2 of them are recounted in the Old Testament. One of them, Stephen read for us. We find it in 1 Kings 17. It's the story of the widow of Zarephath, another widow woman with an only son. Elijah the prophet has fled from his homeland because it's a time of famine. There is no more food, and even the brook where he was hiding, where the ravens were bringing him bread, even that brook has dried up. And so God sends him outside the boundaries of Israel to a widow woman in Zarephath who is preparing her last meal before she dies. And Elijah goes to her and says, "Will you feed me?" She steps out in faith, feeds the prophet, and God provides food for the household. And it seems like everything is going well. The story is going to have a happy ending. And then the son gets sick and dies. And this widow woman asks Elijah such an interesting question that we will come back to later in the message. She says, "Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?" Elijah doesn't answer the question. He simply takes the boy and goes to his bed and 3 times stretches himself over the child and cries out to the Lord. "O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him." And the Lord hears Elijah's prayer. That's one of only two resurrection stories in the Old Testament. The other one comes just a few pages later in the life and ministry of the next prophet in Israel, Elisha. Elisha raises a child, the son of an old woman. Now, she was married, but, well, maybe she wasn't old. The Bible says that her husband was old. And this Shunammite woman, who had done so much to honor the prophet Elisha, had made a room in her home for the prophet, had not asked for anything in return. And one day, Elisha the prophet says to his servant, "What do you think we could do for this woman to thank her for all she has done for us?" And the servant says, "She doesn't have a child, and her husband is old." So Elisha calls her in and says, "Next year, you're going to have a child." And the woman says, "Don't play with me. Do not get my hopes up." And we get the idea that she has spent many years longing for a child, and she has never had a child. And Elisha says, "You're going to have a child." That child is only a few years old, and he gets sick. It's sudden. He's out in the field with his father. He starts complaining about his head hurting, and he's dead that same day. And this woman, bereaved, she goes to the prophet and grabs him by the feet and says, "I will not leave you. You've got to come and do something about this." Great faith. And Elisha the prophet, much like Elijah, comes and takes the child and stretches his body over the child. And God hears the prayer of the prophet and raises this child from the dead. Those are the only two stories in the entire Old Testament of resurrections. Now, you may be thinking, what about Moses? Moses was raised from the dead, but we don't learn the story of it until we get to the New Testament. These two stories, the people of God, the Israelites, the Jews, they knew these stories. The resurrecting power of God through the agency of these amazing prophets, Elijah and Elisha. There's something interesting about these stories, and in fact about all of the resurrection stories in the Bible. Look at Hebrews 11, if you will. Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter, and it's a recounting of some of the great heroes of faith throughout time. We come towards the end of that chapter, Hebrews 11, and the writer of Hebrews in verse 32 says, "How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and on, all of these people who had faith." Now, jumping down to verse 35, we read this: "Women received their loved ones back again from death." Women? Women received their loved ones. Do you notice the miracles, the resurrections were done for women? And Hebrews points this out. Resurrections were done for women who received their loved ones back. And Jesus, in this first resurrection story recounted in the Gospel of Luke, does a resurrection on behalf of a woman, a widow, and this is her only son. Women received their loved ones back again from death, but, Hebrews says, others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. And this points out to us, in just a few words, the reality of resurrection this side of the second coming. If you've ever lost a loved one and have begged God for a resurrection, All the resurrections that have happened so far, except for the resurrection of Jesus himself, those resurrections, these women that received their dead ones back to life, they died again. The widow of Nain joyously reunited with her son on that day. He died again. We long for the ultimate resurrection, after which no one dies again. And in the meantime, as Hebrews says, there are persecutions, and there are trials, and there are sufferings. And the enemy, death, stalks the land and comes calling upon all of us. But there is hope. I want to unpack this story, these two stories really, the parallels between the widow of Zarephath and the widow of Nain. And I'm going to do it under 4 headings. So if it helps you, like it helps me to stay organized, I'll tell you what these headings are. We're going to look at the emotions. We're going to look at the recipients, the results, and the cost. Let's talk about the emotions of these stories, the emotions around death and resurrection. In this account in Luke, Jesus with his disciples and a great crowd is approaching the town of Nain. Now, it's just the next day. He's been in Capernaum. He's worked a mighty miracle there, and now he's traveled. By the way, Nain is just on the other side of the hill, we think, from Shunem. So the Shunammite woman and this miracle of resurrection done by Elisha happens just the other side of the hill from Nain. So everybody there, it makes a little more sense that when Jesus works this miracle, they all say, oh, a great prophet. Because they're thinking, this is somebody like Elijah and Elisha, but even greater. That's the context. So Jesus is approaching this town, and as he's perhaps trying to go into the town, he can't get in because here comes this giant funeral procession. The town has turned out in support of this woman, which is gratifying that she has so much support because really she has lost everything, and she's going to need the support of the town. But Jesus, when he sees her, and probably she is walking ahead of the bier on which her son is laid out. He's probably not contained inside of a coffin the way we do funerals. He's probably just laid out on top of this platform being carried along. And she's walking ahead, and Jesus sees her, and the scriptures tell us he has compassion on her and says to her, don't cry. Now, let me just give you a word of advice. I think most of you are smart enough to realize this. Those are not appropriate words to say at a funeral. When people are grieving the loss of a loved one, do not be so insensitive as to tell them to stop crying. Because if there was ever a time where it's appropriate to cry, it is at a funeral. God gave us emotions for a reason, and when we go through loss, we are supposed to feel it. It's actually a problem if we don't feel it. We're supposed to let those emotions wash over us in the waves as they come and go. And the reality is we cry and we mourn and we suffer through that. But on this occasion, this one occasion, Jesus, filled with compassion, comes up to this grieving mother and says to her, don't cry. Not because it's inappropriate to cry at a funeral, but because Jesus knows he's going to break up this funeral. Pastor Ivan told me this week that he had heard a preacher say, Jesus never preached a funeral sermon. He was always breaking up funerals. Yes. So Jesus shows up at the funeral and he says, don't cry. But we see Jesus, just like we see Elijah, filled with emotion in the face of death. In the story of Lazarus, in the Gospel of John, the shortest verse in the Bible, who can tell me the shortest verse? Jesus wept. When he was confronted by the grief of Mary and Martha, you notice again, women who have lost a brother, Jesus weeps with them. He is touched with our feelings. The emotions of death, Jesus feels them. He sympathizes with them. And, as the Beatitudes tell us, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Here we see Jesus comforting somebody in grief in a way far beyond anybody's expectation that day. In the face of his own death, Jesus again got very emotional. The weight of the cross pressed down upon him. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, he sweat drops of blood and cried out to his Father, "If it is possible, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." The agony, the emotions, the struggle, Jesus knows what it feels like. We're not supposed to be stoic in the face of death. Let's talk about the recipients of these miracles. What does it mean? What is the significance of the fact that over and over again in the Bible, when it comes to resurrection, the resurrections are done on behalf of women? And this is a pattern that holds true almost entirely in the Bible. Those two Old Testament stories, this story, the widow of Nain, Lazarus, Jesus raises Lazarus for his two sisters, Mary and Martha. Dorcas, Tabitha, in the book of Acts, she is a woman who provided care for widows. And her loss was keenly felt by the widows of the church. And so, Peter raised her to life. You see this pattern? Women received their dead back, and especially widows and vulnerable women. See, our society doesn't operate the same way that it did back then. In those days, in a patriarchal society, a woman without a husband and without a male heir, she had nothing. She had no right to land. She had no income. She was extremely vulnerable, dependent upon the charity of those around her. And hopefully she had some other relatives who might take her in and care for her. But there were no guarantees. It was an incredibly vulnerable position to be in. And so this position, a childless widow, was sort of the classic example in those days of the helpless person who could not help themselves. And we see how God, time and again, shows us that it is the needy and the helpless ones that he comes to, that he extends his power and grace towards. And the message here is really good news for all of us. I hope you don't walk out of here thinking that you have to be a widow woman in order to receive the grace of God. The point is that a widow woman is the perfect example of how we all truly are. We are all vulnerable and needy and have no right to look down on anybody else around us, because we all stand in need of the grace of God. And the good news is, it is needy, vulnerable people that Jesus delights to help. It is the needy and vulnerable ones that he has compassion on. And notice, this is not just in a spiritual sense. Of course, Jesus helps us all spiritually. But here is a woman with physical need. Her life is going to be so hard economically because she has lost her only son. And Jesus has compassion on not just a spiritual need, but a physical need. Jesus cares about your economic situation. Jesus cares when people in a society are vulnerable and hurting. His heart of compassion reaches out towards those people, towards all of us. We've looked at the emotions, we've looked at the recipients. Let's talk about the result. And I don't mean the resurrection, but the result of the resurrection. You notice this woman of Zarephath. Elijah raises her son, gives her son back to her, and she doesn't say, "I'm so happy, this is the best day of my life." Now, I'm sure she probably felt happy, and it probably was the best day of her life. But what she says to Elisha is, "Now I know that you've been telling me the truth about God." What is the result of the resurrection in Nain? Jesus raises this young man, and the crowd is filled with fear, and they praise God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today," and the news about Jesus spreads. Here's the result of resurrection. These few exclusive, limited resurrections that we find in the Bible, they are done for a purpose, and the purpose is to confirm the truthfulness of the message and the power of God. "Now I know that you are truly a prophet," the woman says. "Now I know what you've been telling me about God is true." The people say, "Now we know God has visited us, and a great prophet has arisen in our midst." And the news about Jesus spread. So here's a challenge for you. If you are curious about Christianity, but you haven't yet made a decision, you haven't made a faith commitment to follow Jesus because you've got questions, I want to invite you to examine the resurrection of Jesus. One of the purposes of resurrection, as we're discovering, is to confirm the truthfulness of what this individual has said. The truth of the words of Jesus is to be found in the fact that he was raised from the dead. So how do we do that? How do we do that from this vantage point 2,000 years later? How do we examine the resurrection of Jesus and experience it in our lives? And I want to invite you to use your reason and intellect. You know, faith and reason are not opposed to each other. They're extremely compatible. Scriptures invite us to come. God says, "Come now and let us reason together." So as we reason about the resurrection, did this event actually happen? Did a historical person named Jesus of Nazareth actually rise from the dead? If that happened, history has been split in half, death has been overturned, everything changes. That is the question that needs to be answered. Look at the resurrection of Jesus. And I could give you many reasons to consider the resurrection of Jesus to be factual and true. But let me suggest just a couple of them in the short time that we have. And one, let's again talk about women. The Bible delights to lift up women, to lift up those that society looks down upon. No self-respecting man, first century man, in his right mind would make up a story in which the resurrected hero, Jesus, appears first to women. This doesn't give any legitimacy to the story of Jesus, to a first century male mind. If we're going to make up a story about resurrection, we're going to have Jesus appearing to kings and emperors, all male, but women? Nobodies in a garden, out of sight? What? Are you kidding me? The fact that the narrative unfolds the way it does is proof that it's true, because nobody would have made up such a story. Also, consider the fact that the people who became the first preachers of the resurrection were all Jews. Now, first century Jews had instilled in them several important truths, one of which was, there is one God, and he is not a human being. He is personal, he is real. The Eastern gods, the gods of India and places to the east, they were impersonal gods, forces that filled the universe. That was the idea. The Western gods of that time, the Greek and the Roman gods, the Norse gods, now these were personal gods. They had personalities, but they were very limited. You know, you think about some of the Greek stories about Zeus and the others. You know, they have power, but they also have extreme limits placed on them. They can't be everywhere at once, and the other gods are always interfering in their plans. But the Hebrew idea of God is completely different from either the Eastern or the Western concept of God or gods. This one supreme being who fills the universe and yet is personal, and he is God alone. No other gods. That's the heart and soul of Judaism. So suddenly you have not just one or two, not just 12, but hundreds of people. Paul tells us that Jesus, after his resurrection, appeared to several hundred at once, who saw the resurrected Christ and testified to it, and they began to say, it's the first and the last time in the history of the world that Jews began to say, a human being is God. What would cause people to do that? What would cause people so instilled in this concept that there is only one God to say, a human being is God? I mean, that's just, no Jew would ever say such a thing without incredible evidence. And they found that evidence in the resurrection. And even before the resurrection of Jesus, we have a glimpse into who he is right here in this story. Let's think about the differences between Elijah, Elisha, and Jesus. Elijah 3 times stretches his body on this boy and prays and cries out to God, please, please, raise up this boy. Elisha, who you remember had a double portion of Elijah's spirit, he only had to do it twice. But still had to stretch out his body, had to pray, had to agonize, had to ask God to do something. But notice how this story, this simple story, unfolds in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus sees a funeral procession. He walks up, puts his hand on the bier, and he speaks directly to the boy. Young man, get up. Who is this man? He is no prophet. He doesn't have to plead with God and stretch his body over top of this boy's body. He simply speaks the word, and the dead get up and walk. He is the Lord. By the way, I forgot to mention this. This story is the first time in the Gospel of Luke that he calls Jesus the Lord. Go and read back through it, and Luke refers to Jesus as the Lord. It's the first time in the Gospel narrative that he uses that term. Why? Perhaps because this story illustrates for us the power and the authority and the lordship of Jesus. He is Lord of life and death. He holds the power within himself. He is God in human flesh. So the result of resurrection is faith in the person of Jesus Christ. Let's finish by talking about the cost of resurrection. We get a hint of it here in this story. Well, let me start with the story of Elijah. You notice the woman's question? When her son dies, she said, what have you come to do? To point out my sins and kill my son? Why does she go straight to this question of sin? That's not something culturally that probably most people around here would do. Although a few might. You know, what have I done wrong to deserve this? What did I do wrong to bring upon my son? Usually we think in terms of ourselves. You know, what did I do wrong to deserve what happened to me? We don't usually think, what did I do wrong that's now affecting my kids? It's kind of like they've got their own lives to live. But there, in that culture, they're thinking of the family, the group, not so much individualistically. And this woman goes straight to, why are you here? Have you come to convict me of sin and point out, did my son die because of my guilt? That's the question that she's asking. And Elijah doesn't answer the question. He simply prays, and God raises this son. As if in answer to the question, this was not because of your sin, or even if it was, I've got a way of dealing with the sin problem. But let's talk for a minute about sin. Sin always, if it's going to be forgiven, there's a cost associated with that. Think about it. If somebody does you wrong, if somebody sins against you, at first, our natural human response is we want payment, right? Our mind goes to places and we think, well, they did me wrong, I want to see wrong come to them. And we mentally think about all the tragedies that could befall this person that would bring them what's coming to them. But if we are going to forgive, it costs us. It's painful letting go of that desire to see revenge happen. It's hard. Forgiveness is difficult. It costs. Either that person who's done me wrong has to pay, or I have to pay in the letting go of it. There's always a cost. What is the cost in this case? The Bible teaches the wages of sin is death. All who die as a result of sin in this world, die as a result of sin in the human family. Death came into the world because of sin, and that price must be paid. We get a hint in the story of the widow of Nain, because Jesus, as he approaches the funeral procession, he touches the bier. What is that all about? Did you realize that to do that, to perform that simple act, was to become unclean, to become ritually impure? And Jesus walks up in the midst of this day and puts out his hand and instantly, symbolically, becomes unclean as he says to the mother, "Don't cry." What does it cost Jesus to be able to say to us in the face of our sorrows, "Don't cry"? These are not just words, but there's something behind these words to back up. When Jesus bids us, "Don't cry," you know he has good plans, and those plans have come at a cost. And the cost in this story was uncleanness. But as we move through the rest of the gospel, we discover that the cost is that Jesus will take upon himself the weight of the sins of the world. That widow woman in Zarephath, her sins laid upon Jesus, so that her son could live not just for a few more years, but could live for eternity. The weight of every human that has ever lived and ever will live laid upon Jesus, so that each one can have the hope of resurrection. And when I say hope, I don't mean like, I really hope it happens. I mean, it's gonna happen, and it's something that I can look forward to. Jesus went to the cross and was shut out from the presence of the Father, crying out in agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The light of the world was snuffed out. The one who is the resurrection and life had his life taken away so that he could give life and light to all of us. The resurrection power of Jesus is available to you and to me. Right now, today, he wants to offer you new spiritual life, the power of the resurrection in your life right now. And in the face of death, in the face of fear, in the face of tragedy, Jesus gives to you words of hope. You don't have to cry forever. You don't have to be afraid. Because someday, Jesus is coming back to this earth to put an end to that enemy, to put that enemy down forever. And there will be no more death, no more crying. The old order of things will have passed away, and God will say, behold, I make all things new. No more death. Resurrection power is in the hands of Jesus. It's in the voice of Jesus. And his heart is filled with compassion for you and me. Let us pray. Lord, the one who holds the keys of hell and death, you have raised the dead before. And you yourself triumphed over the grave, entering into death itself and spoiling it of all of the captives ever taken. Jesus, our Redeemer and King, we are so grateful for you and your resurrection power. Lord, there are some of us here today who are spiritually dead, and we need that resurrection power right now in our lives. We need you to work a miracle because we have no hope without you. We are needy, helpless people. Thank you that your grace comes to such people. And Lord, for those of us who mourn, thank you for your promise that you will comfort us. And thank you for the hope we all have of living eternally with you in a world without death.